Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning. And I kind of chuckled when Father Joe said, we've got to move to the person from the academic. And I thought, well, the first hour is on academics, then we'll go to the person. So this is what we call fundamental moral theology. It's really critical, and I hope that I can do it justice, because we're dealing with probably one of the most controversial topics in the church today. I think the two areas where we get into most battles today are not on whether Christ was God and man. It's having to do with our moral thinking, our moral rules, and with the liturgy. And as a result of those things, we get some pretty clear battles in our church today. And when they asked me to speak on the issue of conscience, I originally thought, boy, that's the cornerstone of moral theology. And it's really important for us to understand what conscience means for us and how it operates in order for us to do moral theology properly in the church, and even more importantly, to be moral or ethical people. And I want to give you an example of how this works out. I remember years ago, one of our priests was dealing with a young couple that wanted to get married. And there was some kind of problem, I don't remember what it was. I think it had something to do with one of them previously being married in a marriage of convenience. In other words, to get somebody into the country, and then the marriage was dissolved. And of course, there was the whole problem of getting an annulment for this thing and so on and so forth. And what I remember was that the priest followed the rules of the church just letter by letter, and was very good. He was very pastoral, very good with the people. But by the time he got finished with the couple, both families left the Catholic Church. They were so fed up with the whole process and all of the hoops that they had to jump through that they just went elsewhere. And I remember that wise old priest saying to me, I thought I had to do this, but I knew it was wrong. And years later, that line, I knew it was wrong, came back to haunt me, because I find so very often in our church today, there are people that do things because it's the law, and they are not convinced of it. Now, the problem with this is that there's a lot of reasons for not being convinced. We live in a society that is often, for example, very promiscuous. And when you think of the things that people can get into because, well, that's what everybody does, well, obviously, when they are following their conscience, so to speak, they're really following what's the sort of the normal pathways of society. So it's going to be really important for us to kind of go back and think of this exercise on conscience as an effort to try and understand the wisdom of the church, and then get a sense of what we're struggling with in our society today. In order to do that, I want to lay aside one thing that we're going to be very tempted to slip into, and that's the thing that came out of the whole controversy around Humanae Vitae and artificial contraception that popped up in the late 1960s. And when the Humanae Vitae was published, the encyclical was published, and of course artificial contraception was looked upon as totally prohibited, there were a number of reactions in the Catholic world. Charles Curran, for example, at the Catholic University of America, led a number of professors and students on a march saying this is really stupid, and of course he lost his job over that, and he lost his status as a, quotes, Catholic moral theologian. The Canadian bishops rather bravely came together because there was quite a significant revolt among Catholics in Canada. And it wasn't an outright revolt, it was just, this is stupid, we're not going to follow this. And the Canadian bishops tried to soften this, and they came out with a very, very interesting document in which they supported the teaching of the church, because this is the teaching of the church. But they made allowances for the conscience of the individual, even if it is erroneous, that the conscience had to be followed. And to a certain extent, I would say the last 40 years within the church, as far as moral theology have been concerned, has been an effort to try and overturn that statement by the Canadian bishops to make sure that conscience would not go against Catholic Church teaching. Now, the impression is that you've got conscience and you've got Catholic Church teaching, and they are at odds with one another. I'd like you to set that aside right from the start. What we need to understand is what church teaching means, how it affects our conscience, and then what conscience means and how it is called upon to understand and follow, as far as it can, church teaching. So we'll develop that as we go. Now, I chuckled in your prayer service because my opening statement is a famous quotation from Vatican II, which you just heard this morning. Deep within their conscience, men and women discover a law which they have not laid upon themselves. This was a very important part of the Second Vatican Council. This statement was a very clear understanding of the dignity and the uniqueness of each and every human being. And within us, we have, as part of the gift of freedom that is given to us as human beings, we have something that moves us towards the good, that moves us towards what is right, what is good, what is just, and so on. It's deep within us, and it's not our own. It's given to us. It's something, however, that we must obey. Now, here's one of the key words in our modern conversation, which is obedience. And I want you to watch how these words will have at least two major interpretations to them as we follow through this talk this morning. Now, notice this metaphor now. Its voice ever calling them to love and to do what is good and to avoid evil. Its voice. It's like something that speaks within us. That's going to be repeated in a moment here in a slightly different way. But notice the basic law that is being presented here. It's a voice ever calling them to love, to do what is good, and to avoid evil. That's the basic moral law from the scriptures, from our tradition, from theologians, from the teaching of the church. That's the principle that we are supposed to follow. To do good and avoid evil. It tells them inwardly, at the right moment, do this, shun that. At the right moment. When you have to make a decision and you're in the thick of things, it's your conscience that is operative to move you towards the good and to avoid evil. Okay? Now, for they have in their hearts a law inscribed by God. There's another word, a law inscribed by God. And if it's from God, it's a pretty serious law. And in Catholic tradition, this is actually called God's law. God is the one that runs the universe. He's the one that has given us the laws for human behavior. And so God's law is, it's not something that you can argue with, so to speak. So deep within us, there is a law, and it's connected with God's law that moves us in the right directions. Their dignity of human beings rests in observing this law. And by it, they will be judged. Now, their conscience is people's most secret core. It is their sanctuary. There, they are alone with God, and here comes the metaphor again, whose voice echoes in their depths. Now notice the key words here. You've got God, God's law, you've got this whole notion of obedience, you've got this law that's written on our hearts, and you've got this whole notion of conscience, which is somehow the listening to this voice, to the power of the law. And then this quote concludes, by conscience in a wonderful way, that law is made known, which is fulfilled in the love of God and of neighbor. That takes it one extra step beyond do good and avoid evil. The great commandment of Christ, which is really one, love God and love neighbor, which is the one commandment, is where we are supposed to fulfill the work of our conscience. Now, what I want to do is walk you through some of this to help you understand what we mean by conscience. Now, the first thing that I want to get clear is I want you to understand what conscience is not. Okay? And this is very important because we use all kinds of metaphors and thoughts about conscience that sometimes get us in trouble. Contrary to what you've just read here, conscience is not a voice inside you. Notice the phrase that is used about here with regard to God, whose voice echoes in their depths. That was a very, very carefully chosen word. It's not whose voice speaks in your depths, it's whose voice echoes in your depths. Why? Because if you had a voice that you could somehow find inside you, that you would then just simply listen to and obey, you would not be free, except free to obey. That's the only freedom that you would have. And so the implication for some people is, well, conscience is a voice. It's the voice of God inside you. And therefore, when God tells you what to do, That's when you know what's the right thing. But if you stop and follow through on the logic of that, what that means very simply is that you really aren't free as a human being. You are free to listen to the voice or not. That's the only choice that you really have. And in point of fact, that's not the way we operate. Now sometimes, and I must say I really enjoy listening a lot of times to people that are in the charismatic movement, because they have a conversation and a language that is very different than a lot of the official language of the church. And they will often say things like, well, you know, God told me to do this, or I was talking with Jesus and Jesus told me to do this. And all of that is true, but it's true in a sense that I think we sometimes misinterpret. It's as if, you know, Jesus was talking to me personally. Well, Jesus speaks to us in the Eucharist, he speaks to us in the Scriptures, he speaks to us in one another, and we can honestly say, well, I heard Jesus say this to me. But there's a whole process of understanding what you mean by that voice of Jesus speaking to you. And the same thing is true here. When we're talking about a voice within you, what it means very simply is that there's something inside us that moves us towards the good, and we know that that's the God-given gift of conscience. And I'll explain that in a moment, how we determine exactly what that means. But it's very important for you to understand nobody's telling you what to do, not even God. God respects your freedom too much. God loves you too much to take away from you the great gift that God has given to you, which is the gift of your free choice. Okay? Secondly, you need to understand that even though they talk about a law planted deep within us, the law that they're talking about is the most generic law of human behavior. Do good, avoid evil. When you get into the nitty-gritty of how to raise your children, what does it mean to do good and avoid evil? At what point do you spank your kids? At what point do you hug your kids? That's part of the art of being parents. It's part of the art of applying parenthood to this particular child in this particular circumstance. And when I come along as the moral theologian and I say, oh, raising kids is easy. Do good and avoid evil. They kind of go, thanks a load, Father. See you later. And yet, it's very important to understand what this law means for us. It means that that's what we were created for, to do good and to avoid evil. Now, the whole idea of a law, that there's some kind of law within us, is often then taken to the next step, which is, well, if you look deep enough, you'll find the law that guides you with regard to your children or with regard to sex or with regard to justice, and that's what you're looking for. And again, that's a misunderstanding of it. To a certain extent, the most generic laws of moral theology are the laws that then have to be understood and put into practice in the moral teaching of the church, of society, of us as families and individuals, in order that it might in fact be applied to the circumstances of exactly where we are. In other words, there is the law, and then there are laws. And you have to make this distinction when we talk about a law deep within our hearts. It's an analogous notion, which means that it is a drive within us to do good and to avoid evil. But there's no law there, which we will discover and then just simply follow. Now, how this plays out in the church's laws is another issue. But that's a very different thing than the law that is written on our hearts. Okay? Now, there's another thing here that I want to mention because I think it's very important in our society. Conscience is not simply a feeling. You'll so often hear people say, well, I did that because I felt like it was the right thing, or I just had a feeling that this was the right thing. That's great. I don't have any problem with feelings. It's just that feelings have to be put into the context of right and wrong. And so you're not justified by a feeling. A feeling may move you in a pertinent direction, but you need to stop and find out whether that feeling is correct or not. Because where do our feelings come from? Well, many of our feelings come from the world in which we live. I'm kind of struck by this, for example, with regard to the whole issue around sexuality in our church today. How many of our young people get their understanding of sexuality from the church today? Now, they may, learn about it in religious ed classes and so on and so forth. But when it comes to their actual activity, where does that come from? A lot of it comes from our movies and from our culture in which there is this sort of beauty about sexuality, the handsome guy and the beautiful woman, and they come together and everything is hunky-dory. And it's just, there's a kind of a romanticism about this that has very little to do with morality. In fact, anybody that brings up morality is looked upon as, kind of a wet blanket on the party, so to speak. And in the midst of this, we gotta have to sort of step back and say, well, where do we get our values about this from? And a lot of that plays out in our feelings. You watch, for example, teenage girls and their romantic feelings about marriage and, life is going to be beautiful forever after. Where does that come from? It comes from reactions, and many of these are feelings that are part and parcel of the world in which we live. And so when we stop and say conscience is not a feeling, feelings are very much involved, but feelings need to be understood. And I don't want you to get into a contrast between feelings and reason as if, well, we'll do the reasonable thing. That's a very male way of doing things. Feelings are part of the reality of what draws us to things or repels us from things. And I think I'd go off on a whole other talk on this, in the world of morality, I think we need to spend a lot more time understanding our feelings because they are such an important part of how we make choices. Be that as it may, conscience is not simply a feeling. Okay, well, what the heck is conscience? I want you to understand that conscience is nothing other than you, in the depth of your being, making the best decisions you can. Now, you think of that definition, if you want to call it a definition, and you have nothing to fall back on. You can't say, well, conscience is the voice of God telling me what to do. Conscience is the law, and I'm following the law. Conscience is a feeling that moves me in the right direction. All of those things are involved in that, but conscience is nothing other than you, your primordial self, so to speak, making the best decision you can in the freedom and the limitedness that you have as a human being. In other words, there's no escape from conscience. It's you. And this is why conscience is so important. Nobody can take that away from you. In the history of humanity, there are lots of attempts to take away conscience. Torture is one of the key ones. But there's been a lot more subtle efforts through law, through pressure tactics, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, you and I stand on our conscience when we make decisions. And ultimately, as we saw in that quotation, we will stand before Almighty God and we will take responsibility for those decisions. But here's where you need to understand that we use the word conscience analogously. And there's a wonderful article by Timothy O'Connell called Understanding Conscience, or Understanding the Meaning of Conscience. And in there, he talks about three meanings of the word conscience. And this is where you really have to keep these things straight because it's very important. Otherwise, the conversation just goes back and forth and gets nowhere. The first meaning of conscience is what we saw in this definition from the Second Vatican Council. Conscience basically is that drive within us towards what is good. It's built into our reality as human beings. And that's why one of the most frightening things for me in the world is a person without a conscience. In a very profound sense, they are not human. Now, you have to be very careful when I say that because theoretically, we are all built with a conscience. Now, it could be that a child is raised in an abusive situation to the point where the child becomes amoral. We're starting to learn some things about the human brain, and that certain brain damage can literally damage your ability to make moral judgments. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a good example of this, that there are people who literally cannot distinguish good from evil. And so everything becomes focused on self. But even there, what they are doing is they are looking for what is good for me, and they can't see the bigger picture. So on this first level, there is a word for this that comes from the Greek. It's called sundaresis. And what it means very simply is that we've all been given this instinct, if you will, called conscience, which is deep within us to choose what is good and to avoid what is evil. And it's just there. It's part of who we are, and you're going to see how that plays out when I talk a little bit about St. Thomas. The second meaning of conscience would be better put as informed conscience. And this is a very Catholic notion that really demands a lot of understanding. When we today use the word conscience, we toss it off and we're often mixing the three different levels. What we need to do is when we're talking about following our conscience in accord with the teaching of the church, we need to talk about an informed conscience. Because what we're talking about there is the struggle of the church, of humanity, of us as families, communities, and individuals to try and determine what is the right thing to do, generally speaking, and then in these circumstances. And that's where you get the teaching of the church. And not only the teaching of the church, but our own understandings of how it gets applied. So this second meaning of conscience is where most of the debates take place. When we hear, for example, from the Pope, that following your conscience means you have to follow the truth of the church. What we're doing is we're talking about what are the truths of the church that we're expected to follow, and what does it mean to follow your conscience in following those truths of the church? How does all of that play out? And that's where we're going to spend most of today working on that. But there's a third meaning of conscience which is very, very critical. And the third meaning is conscience when you are right in the midst of the nitty-gritty and you have to make a decision, a moral decision, right here, right now, in the specifics of these circumstances, and you stand on your decision-making power and you take responsibility for that. That's conscience where I can argue about what the right thing to do is forever, but now I have to make a decision. And when I make a decision, I am, if you will, putting my conscience into action in those circumstances, and I take responsibility for the decision and for the action and for what the consequences are. In that sense, your conscience is sacred. When you follow your conscience in those circumstances, it may be erroneous. It may be wrong in the sense that you are choosing something that you think is good, but that really is bad. But the teaching of the church through all the centuries has been very clear. You are obliged to follow your conscience. You don't know it's wrong, otherwise you'd have to change that. But if you believe that this is the right thing to do, you are supposed to do it. Okay. Now let me give you an example of this, because this will show you how this plays out on different levels. I want you to think for a moment of, let's say, a young woman who has an abortion. Okay? Now, on the first level of synderesis, or conscience that is given to all of us, she has an instinct to do what is right, to do what is good. Okay? Now, if you think that abortion is the most horrible thing in the whole world, one of the things that runs through your mind is, well, how could she ever choose this? Well, in point of fact, there are 1 million women a year choose abortion in the United States. Why? Where is this coming from? It's because, on the second level, they think that it is good. Okay? Why? Well, if I don't have an abortion, it's going to ruin my career, my family's going to be distraught, I'm going to bring this child into an abusive relationship, and the child is going to be abused by its father. And there's reasons upon reasons upon reasons, and under the circumstances, I know it's not the best thing to do, but I have to do this, and so they have an abortion. Okay? On that level, the teaching of the church is clear. What you have done is wrong. To end a human life that is innocent is wrong, period. However, to make the next step to say what you have done is therefore a sin, you have to distinguish two meanings of the word sin. It's a sin in the sense that you've done something that is evil. But is it a sin in terms of your own conscience and your own heart? You and I can't judge. We don't know. And in point of fact, if that young woman is following her conscience and doing what she thinks she has to do, then as far as we can tell before Almighty God, she's done what she thinks is good. We think she's wrong, it's an erroneous conscience, but she's done what is good. Now I want to show you how this plays out, because I've had this experience a number of times in the confessional. Now the woman comes to me 25 years later, and she is absolutely distraught. And gradually you kind of peel the story out of her, because she's kept a secret for 25 years, and then all of a sudden it pours out and she says, Father, I had an abortion 25 years ago. I feel like I'm going to be damned. Now remember, this is the woman who 25 years ago followed her conscience and did what she thought was right. What's happened? 25 years later she comes back and she puts it into her own words. She said, that would have been my firstborn. and I didn't give him or her a chance to be born. I killed my own child. Now listen to how harsh the language is for herself, judging herself and her own action. Now what's going on here? What's going on is the objective evil that was done, namely an abortion, was subjectively somehow justified through conscience, and now 25 years later she realizes her conscience was wrong. And so now she's filled with guilt, she's overwhelmed by this whole thing, and as a confessor, watch what a very difficult position you get into. Because you can't say to her, oh, well, you know, what you did 25 years ago was okay. It's not okay. What you did 25 years ago, she recognizes now, was evil, was something that destroyed her child, and now she's paying the price for that. What you try to get across in those circumstances is the mercy of God for those who understand that we cannot go back on our choices when we follow our erroneous conscience. What we're trying to do is help her understand that God's mercy is greater than any and all of our sins. But the problem is that in many of the corners of our church, if you've had an abortion, you're considered a sinner with a kind of a tagline for the rest of your life. Can any of you think of a person that I would consider, well, it doesn't help much, a saint who had an abortion? Dorothy Day. Perfect example. Every time her canonization comes up, they say, but she had an abortion. Well, of course she had an abortion because she thought it was the right thing to do. She knew later on that what she had done was wrong, was evil, and she regretted it for the rest of her life. Isn't that what the gospel is all about? In other words, watch, because this is going to be very important in the way we play this out this morning. Watch what is happening here. What is happening is we get into the discussion on conscience about what are the rules and the laws that we're supposed to follow in order for us to do the right thing. And when those rules and laws are put in place, we're expected to follow those rules. And if we follow the rules, then we are good people. What did Jesus say about that? You scribes and Pharisees, you know all the rules. You follow the rules right down to the letter. And you think that you are justified. And remember, and I don't think we get even a tenth, a hundredth of how shocking that parable was about the Pharisee and the publican going to the temple. I mean, when you stop and think about it, the good Catholic goes in, walks up to the front of the church and says, "Dear God, boy, I'm thankful I'm not like all those other bums out there. I pray 5 times a day. I give a tenth of everything I have to the poor. I fast. I obey all the church's laws. I'm a pretty good guy, aren't I?" Now think of that for a moment. And then some public sinner comes in this case it's a tax collector. Let's get a drug dealer. He comes in and he looks around and he goes, "Man, I don't belong to be here, God." He said, all I'm going to do is throw myself on your mercy. And then Jesus says, and who goes away justified before God? Not us, but the drug dealer. Now think about that for a moment. Why is that so important? Because the drug dealer understands he is a sinner. The Pharisee thinks he's not. Why? Because he follows all the laws. And this is an attitude that I think we really have to come to terms with in the church today. If the laws are clear, then our actions should be clear. Well, lots of people aren't following the laws, therefore they must be wrong. And here's where conscience becomes so important in understanding this. People's consciences are not simply formed by the law, they're not simply formed by the church, they're not simply informed by even the Gospels. They're informed by all kinds of things. And so when you come to that third level of conscience where you've got individuals making a decision about how to implement the law, doing what's right and avoiding what's evil, you're going to find some variations there that we have to be very, very careful about judging. Now that doesn't mean that we back off and say, oh, well, sometimes abortion is okay. That's not the point of this at all. The point of this is to understand the limitations of each of those levels of conscience. The one that I called sundaresis, the basic element that is there, we are now finding we trust that that's a gift given to every human being, and we're now finding that with fetal alcohol syndrome, brain damage, and things like that, that sometimes we have what we call amoral people. And boy, that's a huge issue because we're dealing with human freedom, human dignity, human responsibility, and yet the reality of living as an amoral person in a society. Very, very challenging issues. But the biggest area where we have the challenges is on the level of trying to understand how the church's laws play a role in our lives. And here's where I would like to kind of steer you in a direction that I think will help maybe understand a little bit about how to approach these things. Have any of you ever gone into a courtroom and watched a trial? Anybody? Oh, a bunch of you. Great. So you know what I'm going to talk about here. One of the things that's amazing to me when you go in and watch a trial is why the person is on trial to begin with. Because the implication is that this person broke a law. So the person gets charged with breaking the law, and now it's the court's responsibility to find out if he or she really did break the law. And then you get the lawyers arguing about the language and the technicalities and all the different things that go on in a courtroom. And one of the things that's really striking in a courtroom is how the language is narrowed down to something that is manageable for the judge to deal with, okay? So the lawyers know the language and they use all of these different terms. The other thing that's really striking is how boring the whole thing is, because it goes on and on and on and on and on. But the thing that is just astonishing to me is you can go and sit through an entire trial, and what's a trial geared towards? This side says he's guilty, this side says he's innocent, and they heap on everything that they can to show that it's either one or the other, okay? And then what happens? The jury or the judge goes off and they come back, and you tell me if you can guess which way they're going to go. You've heard all the evidence, you've heard everything that's being said. Wouldn't it be obvious that it's one way or the other? Well, what you're seeing is that wherever there's black and white, everything looks very clear. When you get into the messiness of human life, things are just gray, they're just messy. And when you get into that, this lawyer is pulling it apart and saying, no, no, it's all black. And this one's pulling it apart and saying, no, 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 it's all white. And the judge's responsibility to say, well, it can't be gray, it's got to be guilty or not guilty. And this to me is one of the things that really troubles me about the law. That for us, the law becomes this kind of club that we use to demonstrate black from white. And my own experience working in Catholic hospitals, working in all kinds of hospitals and healthcare facilities as an ethicist, was an utter astonishment at how people make decisions, even life and death decisions, when they're facing the issues around medical treatment today. And I watch people making decisions that are sometimes great decisions for really crappy reasons. And then I watch others that reason their way through, they've got a beautiful reasoning process, and they come up with a crappy decision. And I'm in awe of the decision-making processes that we have and use in our world and in our lives. When, however, we put things into the law, we assume that that's going to solve our problems because the law is clear and you just follow the law. And I'll tell you something, it just doesn't work very well. In fact, what I would like you to do, though, is to get your mind away from the law as following this rule and think about it in the church's stance as the wisdom of the church articulated in guidelines for us. Now, there'd be lots of moral theologians that would dispute with me on this, so I want you to take this with a grain of salt. For them, the law is the law. That's all there is to it. But what I've come to understand is how the wisdom of the church is often captured in laws, but the laws are then used like clubs to keep people in line and make sure that they follow the laws. And the more I read the Gospels and the more I read about St. Paul and his understanding of the law, the more I think we're probably struggling with the same thing today that Paul and even Jesus dealt with in his time. The law becomes a substitute for God. In other words, if you follow the law, how could even God judge you as doing something wrong? That was the Pharisees' attitude. And I find that too often today, the attitude is that if we follow the law, then we can stand before God and say, I'm a good person. Now tonight I'm going to talk about sin and sinfulness, and I'm going to try and make that clear why that's just so anti-gospel. It's the exact opposite of the gospel. But here's what I want you to understand. The law does give us guidance, wisdom, direction. It gives us the tradition of the church. It gives us all kinds of riches that we need to make part of our informed conscience. That's that second level of conscience. So an informed conscience is going to be one that really does take time to be instructed and to understand what is right and what is wrong. Okay? Now let me give you an example of this, because I think it's one of those things where this is all theoretical stuff and it's important, but you've got to see how it plays out in reality. Let's take an example. One of the examples that I don't want to develop too far, but I want to show you how this works. I want you to think for a moment about, we had this big controversy in Canada about 7 years ago on homosexual marriages. Will the state allow homosexuals, gays or lesbians, to get married and to have all the benefits, the rights, and the duties and responsibilities of marriage? And of course, Rome got in on the act very quickly and opposed this, because a marriage can only take place between a man and a woman, and all of our definitions of marriage were gathered around that whole aspect of a man and a wife, the sexual intercourse that is open to procreation and the mutual love of the couple, and so on and so forth. And so by definition, a gay or lesbian couple cannot have any kind of intercourse that would be open to procreation, and therefore by definition there is no such thing as a gay or lesbian marriage. Now, how do we get to that term? Well, notice what I've done there. It's all by definition, and if it's definition, it's black and white. There's no arguing, there's nowhere else to go. Then some moral theologians stand up and say, well, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't talk about marriage. But obviously we've got people that don't fit into these categories of male and female attracted to the opposite sex, so what are we going to do with them? Well, the church's logic is very simple. They are to be celibates, because they can't be engaging in any kind of sexual activity outside of marriage. So, end of discussion. Well, I'm a celibate by choice. I know that's not easy. So why would you stick this on a bunch of people because of the way they're born? To make a long story short, a lot of homosexual people within the Catholic Church are arguing maybe what we need to do is to move towards partnerships, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, in the state of Massachusetts, there was that very interesting argument before the Supreme Court in which they said you have to call it marriage, because if it's anything other than marriage, it will be put into a different category and they just will not have the same benefits and bonuses of marriage. I'm not sure that that's true, but the reality is that that's something you have to keep in mind. But the big question for me in this whole thing was, well, how did we get to this point? Where do we come from? And the answer is, well, we've got a law, and the law is by definition. And I think, well, wait a minute, that doesn't give you an informed conscience, that just gives you a law that you're expected to follow. So I start asking questions, well, where do we inform our conscience? How do we inform our conscience? And to make a long story short, I want to give you 4 sources to just think about for a morning. The first one is Scripture. What does the Scripture tell us about homosexual activity? Now, I want you to think about this for a moment, because first of all, the word homosexual does not appear in the Scriptures. In fact, the word homosexual was coined in the mid-1800s by a Hungarian psychologist. Okay? So now today we talk about homosexuality as if we can go back to the Bible and talk about all kinds of homosexuality in the Bible. What we're talking about in the Bible are same-sex relations, that's all. Okay? Now, to make a very long story short, if you actually go back into the Scriptures, you will find out that there's very little in the Scriptures that's about homosexual activity. What is there is quite negative, but there's very little. There's that passage in Genesis around the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the townspeople going to the messengers, who are really angels, and demanding that they be put out for carnal knowledge. Then there's 2 passages in the book of Leviticus in which it is stated very clearly that if a man lies with a man as with a woman, that is anathema, and the second one, then they are to be stoned to death. That's it. And there's one other little reference in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, there's a list of sins which includes, it depends how you translate them. The Greek words are malakoi and arsenokoitai. And those 2 words are translated sometimes as sodomy, which means anal intercourse, and catamy, I think, is the other one, which I never did figure out what that is. But what they're aiming at, as far as we can tell in the Greek, is the dominant person in a male-male relationship, and then the submissive partner in there. That's what those 2 words seem to mean. But they're just sort of, they're tossed off in the same sentence about not getting into the kingdom of heaven as, for example, gossipers. So, you know, tough luck, gossipers. But they're the ones that we sort of concentrate on. And then there's that famous passage in the first chapter of Romans. And in the first chapter of Romans, there is a very clear statement about the Gentiles. And you can tell how corrupt the Gentiles are because the men lust after the men. And then this is the only time in the scriptures where this statement is, and the women lust after the women. Okay? Now, all of that is pretty negative. But here's a question that you should ask yourself. Do the scriptures say anything at all about the possibility of a homosexual partnership that is loving, enduring, and lasting? They couldn't even conceive it. Because in the social context in which they lived, what did homosexual relations mean? Well, as far as we can tell, it meant probably exploitation of young boys by rich men. There were probably males that went around, these young Adonises that went around and allowed themselves to be used like prostitutes. There was probably temple prostitution that involved males. There were certainly effeminate males around. And all of this would have been, particularly for a Jew, would have been horrifying because you are called as a Jew to have offspring to serve God. And in the midst of all of this, the one thing that gets overlooked is that passage in Romans chapter 1, which is about these horrible, awful, sinful homosexual people, is in a passage that's 3 chapters long to prove that we're all sinners. That's the thing that's so amazing about it. But we kind of backtrack from that and then we point fingers. So when you start looking at the scriptures, you start saying, well, what do we get from the scriptures? And quite often it's pretty mild stuff, relatively speaking. So therefore we need to go to the tradition. Well, the tradition is pretty straightforward too. Any kind of homosexual activity is considered sinful. In fact, in the penitentials that were written in the 5th and 6th centuries, mostly by the Irish monks when they were going to hear confessions, are quite interesting because they do list homosexual sins, also bestiality and stuff like that. But here's the interesting part. If you are involved in a homosexual sin, then you get a certain punishment. But if you're a monk or a nun and you're involved in a homosexual sin, you get twice the punishment because you're supposed to know better. And the interesting thing about that is it's in the penitentials because it's taking place, okay? So it's a reality. I'm trying to remember where I was a couple of years ago, and I saw this picture on the wall, and I looked at it, and at first it looked like a pool with people swimming in it, and I got a little closer, and it's a pool of fire in which there are men burning, and then there's all these officials standing around on the outside like this, and underneath it's got the burning of homosexuals in Florence in 15-something or other. And I'm thinking, wow, it's no wonder there's no literature and stuff about them because it was so dangerous to be gay and lesbian. But the reality is that if you go through the tradition of the church and you start to find this quite negative statement about it, there was never any real attempt to kind of deal with the reality of homosexual persons. So if you continue on, those are the first 2 things, scripture, tradition. What's the teaching of the church? Well, the teaching of the church was very clear until Cardinal Ratzinger made a statement in a document concerning certain sexual matters back in, I think, 1987, in which he made a distinction. Homosexual orientation is not a choice, and therefore it's not a moral issue. But homosexual activity is. Now I want you to think for a moment about applying that rule in the church. If you've got a homosexual couple in your parish, are they to be condemned because they're a couple? Of course not. Homosexual orientation is not something that we can judge morally. So what would we judge them for? Homosexual acts? Do we check them out on Sunday morning before they come in and find out, did you guys do something you shouldn't? Do you do that with married couples? Do you see what I'm getting at here? Do you see how our attitudes start to control the way we think about these things, and we don't even follow our own teaching? Our own teaching, very simply, I mean, it's going to sound a little bit like don't ask, don't tell, but basically what I find is that we in the church so very often, and I've seen bishops do this, condemn homosexual persons because they're persons who have a homosexual orientation, which is totally against the church's own teaching. I watched a bishop fire a secretary from a parish because he was gay. I couldn't believe my eyes. He wanted the pastor to fire him. The pastor refused. The pastor lost his job, the secretary got fired, and the bishop just holed up for about 3 months till the issue died down. Why? Well, what turns out was there were people in the parish who said that man is gay, he should not be working in the church. Where does that come from? It's called sinfulness, except we blame the homosexual. Do you see what I'm getting at here? It's very important for us to understand that when we start to go back and we look at issues of the church, we look at the scriptures, we look at our tradition, we also look at how things are applied, we look at what the church teaching is and what it's not, and then we start looking at what we call reason and science and experience. Just to give you an example, this is one of the things that I've come across quite a number of times in the healthcare system. When we're all conceived, and that embryo starts to grow and eventually becomes a fetus, this may be a shock to some of you, but we all start off female, okay? And then about 5 or 6 weeks, those that have the XY chromosome, the male chromosome, then they start to develop as males, okay? And as they develop as males, then of course the testes are formed and so on and so forth. Now the interesting thing is that whatever happens in that development, every once in a while, the transition from female to male is not complete. And you end up with somebody in between. The most dramatic examples of these are when you've got people who have both a vagina and a penis. It happens, it's hard to get statistics on this, but 1 in 1,000, and hormonally, this mixture of male and female is probably 3 in 1,000, okay? Now, what does that mean? It means that by nature, there are some people that are not simply male or female. And we're a church, and I'm not going to go into this, but we're a church of natural law. The problem is that we assume that nature is either male or female. And the consequence is, Benedict has come out with a very clear statement that if you are homosexual, you are disordered. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds horrible. Well, what he means very simply is the order of the universe that God ordained is male or female. So something's wrong and these people are disordered. But the implication is it's their fault. That's the problem that we get into because we jump to conclusions from these things. Then if we stop and we say, well, if you are neither male nor female, what does that mean for how you live your life? Do you see how we're now starting to move into the moral area and we're starting to ask questions about what is your nature? What is appropriate for you? What does make sense? What is good for you? And then if we start listening to experience, who do we get experience from? Male celibates in Rome. They have all the experience in the world. Right? I mean, this is a real problem in the church. We don't spend time listening to women. We don't spend time listening to married couples. We don't spend time listening to gay and lesbian people. When you stop and listen to gay and lesbian people, one of the things that is most impressive to me is how many of them have fought to keep their Catholic faith. They really have, against all kinds of bigotry, all kinds of put-downs, all kinds of sort of official ways of denigrating people. And the part that just really frightens me is how much they've suffered. Suffered in their families, guys that have been kicked out because they came out of the closet. And the father says to him, "You're not my son." That's it. How they've been picked on. Well, you all know the stories. And in the midst of this, we call ourselves a church that stands by the vulnerable. And we don't. I mean, literally, we don't. So how do we put all of this together? What I want you to do is to take a step back now and say, well, what is the wisdom of the church in all of this? And I want to show you that the wisdom of the church, very simply, is it's a defense and a protection of marriage. And I think that's very important, and I think that's a critical component of building society. I think it's a critical component of taking seriously our faith when we talk about the sacrament of marriage and living the presence of Christ. But marriage doesn't become all-consuming then. What it means is the wisdom of the church is trying to protect something that really is sacred and that really is important, but you can't just harm other people that don't fit that category. And as a result, what do we mean by the wisdom of the church when we're dealing with homosexual issues? Well, if we take our own teaching seriously, it wouldn't be a big deal because homosexual orientation is not a choice. And what people do in their private lives moves then from that informed conscience to the decisions that they make that you and I have no right to judge in terms of their subjective culpability or guilt or sin. In other words, now this is really tough stuff in the sense that I want you to understand how important that second level of informed conscience is, because that's where we debate, that's where we work these things through. And I mean, I can speak as a moral theologian, I can speak from a lot of experience that in the church, we're not allowed to do a lot of that today. And especially once the law comes out, it's like that's the end of the discussion, which is what happened with artificial contraception. The law came out with the encyclical Humanae Vitae, and that's the end of the discussion. It didn't matter how many protests there were. It doesn't matter how many people in our society don't pay any attention to that at all. It doesn't matter how many people would like to speak against that. All of that is over and done with, and I want you to know that that's not a moral issue. It's an issue about authority within the church. And that's why the step from informed conscience to applied conscience is so critical. It's critical because I can stand as a Catholic moral theologian and say to you quite honestly, if I am not convinced by the arguments and the teaching of the church, not the fact that it's taught by authority, but by the arguments and the teaching of the church on moral issues, I will and have to follow my conscience even if it's going against that teaching. Now, I have to be very careful here because I can't then go to you and say, well, the teaching of the church is not very good or very clear. I can make that as clear as I can to you, what the arguments are for the teaching, because I feel that that's my responsibility as a moral theologian, and I can make the arguments that make it hard to really understand and to absorb as the truth, so to speak. But then I can't follow your conscience. You have to follow your conscience. Let me give you a simple example of this, because I've done this very often with in vitro fertilization. Couples come to me and they ask me about what's the teaching of the church. I give them a very clear statement of the teaching of the church. I present all the arguments in favor of this, and then I point out that one of the things you have to realize is that in Donum Vitae, which was the document that talked about in vitro fertilization and that most Catholics think then says in vitro fertilization is unethical, what the document says is in vitro fertilization as presently practiced is unacceptable. When a moral theologian sees as presently practiced, then you know that the process itself is not evil, but there are moral problems with it. One of the moral problems is a child, this is the principle that's in the document, a child has the right and should be conceived through the mutual love of the couple which takes place in sexual intercourse. It's a great principle. It's a wonderful sort of overarching guideline for the beauty of marriage, the procreative aspect of marriage, and so on. But what happens if they can't get pregnant through normal sexual intercourse? Well, there are ways that we can help them. There are things like gamete intrafallopian transfer, which is sort of moving a sperm or moving the eggs around so that there's a better possibility. But it's just kind of, you know, adding a little touch to this thing. Well, what about in vitro fertilization? Well, assuming that you don't create excess embryos, that you don't store them away and then throw them away because those are human lives, then this issue becomes, well, you have to have a child conceived through sexual intercourse. Now, watch what happens when a good moral theologian who is also a legalist tackles this. The good moral theologian says, well, okay, let's see what we can do here. We'll have the couple come to the office, the doctor's office. They will have intercourse in the office, and we will use a condom to gather the sperm. However, a condom is a contraceptive, so we will put a pinhole in the condom so that it's open to procreation, okay? Then we will take the sperm and the eggs, and even though this is pushing it a little bit, we will join them together in the Petri dish, and then we will insert them in the woman's uterus, and it will be like a sort of an extended act of intercourse, sexual intercourse, okay? Now, John Paul has a wonderful statement in his document, The Splendor of Truth, Veritatis Splendor, in which he talks about when you've got laws, how clever human beings are at getting around the laws. Nobody's more clever than that than the moral theologians, except perhaps the canon lawyers. So, but what I want to point out here is I have often had couples sitting in my office, and when they are very clear about not creating excess human lives, excess embryos, I put it to them, here's what the church's teaching is about a child having a right to be conceived. And, you know, it's so interesting to watch the reactions of the people. Well, I mean, we've tried that for 5 years, for 10 years. It doesn't work. Why would the Pope not allow us to get a little bit of an assistance? They just cannot understand this. And I say very simply to them, you have to follow your conscience. I can't tell you that you can do this. I can only explain to you what the teaching of the church is. I explain what the reservations are, but you are now informed and you have to follow your conscience. Do you see how that plays out then? You've got that whole level where we're in dialogue and the church is in dialogue and we're trying to understand what the rules of the church are so that we can apply them. But when it comes to actually applying them, if you honestly say to yourself, now watch how this plays out in two different directions. If you say to yourself, man, that just doesn't make any sense to me. I've been through this, I've studied it, I've tried, I don't get this at all. That's fine. You have to follow your conscience. But here's an interesting version of that. I had a very, very pious couple come to me one time. I explained to them the teaching of the church on the particular issue that they were working on, explained some of the difficulties with it, and their response was pretty much the following. It was, well, I don't understand why the church is so hard on this, and I don't understand why the church is teaching on this, but it comes from the Pope, so we're going to follow it. And I said to them, God bless you. That's part of your conscience. In other words, when you say, well, I don't get this, my instinct would be to say, well, then you have to follow your conscience and do what you think is right. But part of their conscience was very clearly that they could not go against the teaching of the Pope, even though they didn't understand it and they didn't think it was very good teaching. But they're following their conscience. So do you see how that plays out? Now, the reason that this is so important is because we get into this we call it conservative liberal battle in our church today. And there's a lot of kind of put downs from one side to the other. I've really come to respect a lot of the conservatives who live their faith in the church. I fight with the conservatives on the level of theological argument and so on and so forth. But I've watched very conservative people, and they live a kind of a spirituality that makes sense to them. And I think it's very important for us, for anybody that doesn't live that kind of spirituality, to at least respect it. They really are trying to follow God's will, and in many cases, whatever their background is for them, what the church teaches is God's will, and it's not a big deal for them. They will follow it. But when you do start to take these things seriously, and what happens, and this is again what I learned in the hospitals, what happens is many times they start to follow it and it just falls apart because it doesn't make sense. And then that's when you need to be there. You need to give them it's kind of a compassionate shoulder to cry on, but you also need to get them to understand that there's an added step there that they can take if they so choose. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because the temptation of many moral theologians and many, many priests is to make your decisions for you. And I don't know how many times I've had people come to me, this happens regularly, they come to me and they say, Father, I'd like your permission to do this. And what they want to do is simply wrong. But if they get my permission, then it's right. You see? And this is where authority is part of the whole moral decision-making process. Authority does not justify this for you, but it's one of the factors that you have to take into account as you apply these particular principles and these ways of doing things. Now, what time are we taking a break? Who's in charge here? Nobody. Good. We're going to talk all morning. We'll get a break shortly. I run out of things in about 2 days. So, now, having said all of that, here's where I want to point out something that's going on in the church today that's very, I think, important to understand, because it's taken me years to get some clarity on this. There are two traditions of moral theology in the church at work today. To oversimplify, one is the tradition of law, authority, obedience, obligation. The other is the tradition of law, authority, obedience, tradition, and responsible conscience. Notice how I put those things together. But here's the two traditions that are going on, and I think you will recognize some of this. St. Thomas Aquinas, in his famous Summa Theologica, which is the compendium of all theology, that's really what Summa means, and he was trying to get clear the theology at his particular time and deal with all kinds of questions that were under debate. But if you read his Summa very carefully, he starts with a whole treatise on God, who is God, and how does God relate to us, and so on and so forth. Then he goes on to the treatise on what it is to be a human being, and he talks about human freedom, our relationship with God, and there is at least one serious argument that says that he wrote the whole Summa precisely to come to the point of making clear what the moral teaching of the church was and how we're supposed to follow that. And when he comes to that, he starts by talking not about the law and what we're supposed to do. He starts by talking about virtue, who we're supposed to be, okay? Now, this is a very interesting thing that's going on in the world of Catholic moral theology today. In the 1960s, we had all the battles about contraception, sexuality, premarital sex, and so on and so forth. And those battles went on and on and on, and it was kind of like, here's the law of the church, no, we think this is the way. And it was a battle for the law. And now, because the authorities of the church think that all of those things are settled, what you're finding, that's true, what you're finding is that more and more moral theologians are ignoring those issues. If you go, for example, to the Alfonsianum, which is our Redemptorist Institute in Rome for teaching moral theology, and it's got a great reputation. There's many, many bishops around the world that did their studies at the Alfonsianum. There is not a course offered on sex or sexuality today. And the reason is very simple. The professors found that in every one of their courses there would be students who would report them to the various dicasteries in Rome, and they would be constantly going over there and trying to explain, no, I didn't say that, that student doesn't understand, and so on. So they just said, to heck with it, no more teaching on this. What moral theologians are now investing in is a much more gospel-based virtue ethic. Because the question is not, what laws do I follow? The question is, how do I become a disciple of Jesus Christ? What kind of person do I need to be? And as a result of this, what they're trying to emphasize is you've got to go back to the Gospels. You've got to go back to Christ. You've got to go back to the spirituality that is part of our world. And you see, in the tradition of the Catholic Church, moral theology was tied in with spirituality until you got to the Middle Ages, in which case it got split off, and there's a bit of a tradition of this, in order to deal with sins that went into the confessional so that the confessors knew how serious they were, how to give advice, and how to give a penance. And so more and more moral theology became the rules, and not just the rules, but all of the different sinful things that human beings could be involved in. Meanwhile, the tradition of spirituality went off to retreat houses and places where, you know, you could kind of develop your own sense of prayer and devotion and private and so on. But it was like the two of them were separated. What moral theologians today are doing is saying, you can't separate those two. You've got to pull them together, and the law has to be the servant of your discipleship. Not in the sense of the law is whatever you want it to be, but first and foremost, you have to be disciples. Now, for many people, being a disciple means following the law, but that's not where most moral theologians are going. Most moral theologians are saying, pay attention to the law, and I'm going to use some examples of this in the second part of this talk. Pay attention to the law, and that will give you some guidance and some help, but what kind of follower of Jesus do you want to be? Now, what kind may sound strange. You're either a follower or you're not. Well, think about that for a moment. Think about those that become monks and nuns. Think about those that, there's a great couple in Houston, Mark and Louise Zwick, who look after the Houston Catholic Worker. Man, I read the stuff that they're doing out of their Catholic faith, and it's stunning how they are living the life of the Spirit, looking after the poor and particularly the refugees. When you start to see these things, you start to realize that the gospel takes priority. But we spend way too much time in moral theology fighting over the rules. If we go back to a virtue ethic, then we're going to find out what St. Thomas did was he started with the virtues. And the key virtues are faith, hope, and charity. Those are the ones that we're supposed to build into our lives. Every other virtue is supposed to support that. But when you strive to be a virtuous person, to be a good person, a gentle person, a compassionate person, what you find is that you run into lots and lots of questions or problems or conundra that you don't know quite how to solve. Think for a moment of a nurse working in a hospital, a good nurse, compassionate nurse, a gentle nurse, a nurse who loves her patients, a nurse who spends time with the people, who listens to the patients. And now she's got to make a decision about whether or not to tell a family that this particular treatment is no longer good for this patient and should be removed, but it means the patient will die. And the nurse is saying, is that the right thing to do? That's where the law comes in. That's where the wisdom of the church over the centuries has been put into a form that helps her to determine whether or not this is a good thing to do. Now the tricky part is, the temptation then is to just sort of skip everything else and just go to the law and find out what the right thing is to do. And that's where Jesus reacted so strongly against the Pharisees and the scribes. That's not good enough. You've got to be doing this in connection with your Father in heaven. And this is where you get the two different traditions, I think, about moral theology in the church. One of them, I mean, there's lots of talk around this, but it basically is the tradition of follow the laws. And what that comes out as now is that the laws are God's law, now taught by the church, so how could you argue with God's law? And therefore it is the truth, and it's always with a capital T. And if it's the truth, and you watch how both John Paul II and Benedict emphasize this over and over and over again, if it's the truth, there's no point in discussing it or arguing about it anymore. It's simply the truth, and you follow the law. Your job is to be an obedient Catholic. Okay? You don't believe me? You do believe me. Take the definitive statement on the ordination of women. Not a perfect example? No need to discuss this anymore. In fact, if you discuss it, we will punish you. Why? Because this is the truth. And you think, where did this come from? That's the problem. At any rate, I'm going to get in lots of trouble with this. But you can see the tradition here, which is the tradition that then depends to a great extent on the teaching authority of the church, the obedience of the faithful, and the simple belief, if you will, that the truth is the truth, and now you know black from white. Now I want to point out one thing about this particular attitude, because I mean I struggle with it, but I want you to see the wisdom in it, because this has always been a part of the church's teaching, a church of way of teaching. But the wisdom of this is very simple. The wisdom is that we live in a world of great relativism. And as a result, if I say to you, listen, abortion is wrong, and you come to me and you say, well, that's your opinion, my opinion is it's right, that's the end of the moral discussion, because it's all about opinions. There are moral norms that are very, very sound and that we are to follow. There are questions about how absolute some of them are, but that's for moral theologians to debate. But there's a wisdom there in the midst of our society that I want you to keep track of, because there's an awful lot of dismissal of moral values in our world today because of the whole way it's thought about in our society. In fact, very often in the hospitals, what I found interesting is that the Catholics had a theology and anthropology, a moral theology that led to the conclusions that we made morally. In the public hospitals, they always went back to the law of the land. So for example, they will say things like, and you'll hear this in the argument about assisted suicide, at least in Canada, in 1972, suicide up till then was considered a crime. So if you tried to commit suicide and you failed, you ended up in jail. And everybody in jail was saying, what the heck are they doing here? There's other problems that they have to deal with. So they took it off the books. Today, you hear them arguing, well, suicide is not a crime, therefore, we should be able to use it. We should be able to do it. Just a total misunderstanding of these things. At any rate, it could be God knocking on the window saying now, the second path is the one that I think comes from St. Thomas. First of all, St. Thomas builds on this whole idea of synderasis. We are made to choose the good. So why do we so often choose what's evil? It's because it comes to us under the guise of good. It looks good. We make it look good. We want it, therefore we make it look good. And that's the real art of moral discernment. It's to determine what really is the good and then choose that. And an assistant to that would be the law. That's the way St. Thomas sees it. And law, as far as St. Thomas is concerned, when it's very generic, holds absolutely. So do good and avoid evil is an absolute moral law. Thomas would probably, he would have struggled with this one. Is it okay under some circumstances to kill a human being? Well, in the church's tradition, yes. The circumstances are self-defense. If there's such a thing as a just war, a just war. Here in the States, you've still got something? Capital punishment, that's a tricky one. Now here's an interesting one. Certain kinds of abortion. What kinds of abortion? No. Indirect. Indirect abortion. Okay? Now what's an indirect abortion? Well, it's where you're doing something else, like taking out a cancerous uterus, But the only way to do that is to also take out the fetus that is there. But you don't want to do that, it's not intended, but you have to do that in order to look after the person, and therefore it's an indirect abortion, okay? But rape is not permitted. Why? Because the innocent fetus. So what you end up with is, at least my interpretation of St. Thomas, is that his rules, his moral rules, as they are pulled to us out of human tradition and wisdom, are for us something that holds ut in pluribus, which is a Latin phrase that means for the most part. Are there circumstances where you could kill another person, another human being, which don't fit those four categories? St. Thomas would allow us to at least think about it. Maybe there's a circumstance, maybe there's not. Here's an example. Most of you are familiar with this famous case that took place in Phoenix last year. The case of a woman who came in with pulmonary hypertension. Her blood pressure was so high that when she came in and she was 9 weeks pregnant, that the doctor said to her, you have a 50-50 chance of survival. But if we remove the fetus, the blood pressure will go down and you have a very good chance of survival. And the woman said, 50-50, I want to give the baby a chance. She came in 2 weeks later. Her pulmonary hypertension was so high, the doctor said, you have virtually a 100% chance of dying, along with the fetus, which is only 11 weeks old and can't live on its own. The ethics committee went to work on that, and basically following some opinions of moral theologians, and some very conservative moral theologians, determined, and this is the moral argument, both are dying, we can only save one, which is the mother, and therefore, under these circumstances, we can perform a direct abortion in order to at least save the life of the mother. And Germain Grisez, who's a very conservative Catholic moral theologian, had actually argued that this was permitted because the fetus could not live and therefore could be removed to save the life of the mother. Now, you're all aware that this turned into a big political foofara, but the bishop came out and said it was a direct abortion that's totally prohibited by the church, and therefore I'm punishing the hospital and, of course, the poor sister that was the head of the ethics committee, and I'm doing this in the name of the truth. Now, this is where you run into problems, because what you're saying is we've got the laws that are black and white, and this tradition says, I don't believe that. Now, here's the interesting thing from the point of view of a moral theologian. A moral theologian looks at this and says, you know, we've been arguing about this for at least 35 years, that there are circumstances where you may have to perform a direct abortion. To give you an example, there's an Australian moral theologian by the name of Norman Ford. And Norman Ford, seeing this problem, started snooping around, and he found a Jewish argument. And the Jewish argument was that if the fetus, if the child in the womb is going to kill the mother by just its presence there, then the child is an unjust aggressor and can be removed. Okay, now an interesting argument. Norman Ford didn't have that argument out on print, and within 3 weeks, Rome came out and said that's an invalid argument. The child is innocent. You cannot directly kill an innocent child. Why? Because they're protecting an absolute moral norm. And the absolute moral norm is thou shalt not, it's not thou shalt not kill people. It is never morally permissible to directly kill an innocent human being. Notice the two adjectives, directly and innocent. And what that means very simply is we've got an absolute law and there are no exceptions. Now, the whole history of moral theology is to deal with the stuff on the fringes and to say, but that doesn't make sense in these circumstances. Now, others might say, that doesn't make sense in terms of rape. Okay, well, let's argue the thing through. But in these particular circumstances, you're going to have two die, or just one. And the argument that some moral theologians following the church's teaching would be to say, it's better to allow two to die than it is to kill one. Well, that's assuming that the killing one is somehow morally culpable. It is if you've got a moral absolute. And most moral theologians would say this is just not right. I mean, talk with the people on the street. Is it better to allow two to die or to kill one? Now be careful, because you can apply that principle in a lot of different places. But when you start to add the other arguments, that there's just no way that they can live, that this is the only possible solution. And I must say, it's been very interesting talking with Catholic doctors about this, because a lot of Catholic doctors, I remember having a we'll take a break in a couple of minutes here, or an hour or so. I remember talking with a bunch of Catholic doctors that came together to form a Catholic Doctors Guild in one of the cities that I worked in. And I went and visited. I had a really interesting evening with them. And in their midst, there were 2 Catholic doctors out of 12 who were absolutely fixed on the teaching of the church. You cannot prescribe contraceptives. You cannot do this. You cannot do that. And everything was you cannot. And afterwards, one after the other Catholic doctors came to talk with me, and they all said the same thing. If this is what being Catholic means, we're not interested. And they were conflicted. Most of them would not participate in any way in abortions. That was very clear. But the whole thing on contraceptives, it just didn't make sense to them. But they were not simply following their conscience. They were also dealing with other people. And this is where you get into real problems when you don't allow the discussions that are necessary in order to clarify exactly how these principles work and how they are applied. But our way of dealing with that is to say, on this side, when we're dealing with the reality of principles that hold ut in pluribus, you've got to then develop the informed conscience so that people can make the best decisions they can under the circumstances and pay the price. I mean, if you decide I'm going to have an abortion and then you go around and say to everybody, I followed my conscience and I had an abortion, I mean, it's going to be the responsibility of the pastor or the bishop to say, well then, there's something that you've done here that's wrong. That's the objective reality, and you can't teach that as a way of life for a Catholic. But you see the difficulties that you get into then in the public forum.